if you want to. For example, there is a 33% chance of probability. So is there any chance to increase or decrease the probability?
Can you set these probabilities, not using these same functions? Can you set the probabilities? But you can absolutely implement some of your own functions or use more sophisticated functions that do exist in this library and others to exercise more control. These are meant to be very user-friendly and simple functions, certainly the ones we looked at that give you equal probability for all of those. But absolutely, you could skew things, though hopefully if you're implementing a gambling game or the like, you're not actually making some cards more probable than others. Allow me to turn back now to our implementation here of this randomness and consider how we might leverage other types of functionality that aren't necessarily in this specific library here. Well, it turns out that Python also comes with a statistics library, and this contains all sorts of functions for doing things more statistical in nature, namely calculating means or medians or modes or other aspects of a data set that you might want to analyze. So how might we use the statistics module in Python? Well, we might first just take a look at its documentation like any other module in Python, and we'll see within that library that there's a whole bunch of functions. And one of those functions is one that's quite simple. It's average, a function that allows you to calculate the average of some numbers that you've passed in. Let me go ahead and in VS Code in my terminal window, open up a new file called average.py. And at the top of this file, I'm going to import a different library this time, namely the statistics module in Python. And now I'm going to go ahead and call a function that I know comes in that module, namely mean, for the average of some values. And I'm going to call statistics.mean. And I'm going to pass into this function mean a list of some values. And let's suppose that I'm quickly trying to calculate what my current grade average is in school. And I did really well on my first test, and I got 100%. And on my second, I did well, but not as well, and I got a 90. And ironically, I'm not very good with math, so I'd like to figure out what my average now is between those two tests. So let me go ahead now and in this list, type in the number 100, comma 90, thereby passing in a list of two values, two ints, 100 and 90. And outside of those are the parentheses, because of course this is now the argument I'm passing to the function called mean. And this function mean is in the module called statistics. Well, it's not that interesting to just calculate the mean if I don't actually see what it is. So let me additionally pass the return value of that mean function to the print function as usual. Let me now in my terminal window in VS Code type in Python of average.py and hit enter, and voila, as you might expect, my average is 95%. So the difference here is that I'm just using a different module that still comes with Python, but I need to import it instead of, for instance, the random module instead. And this time I know from the documentation that there exists a function called mean. Well, it turns out there's even more functionality that comes with Python and that comes with other modules in Python. And there's this feature generally known as command line arguments. This is a feature not just of Python, but of languages more generally that allow you to provide input not when prompted inside of a program, as happens whenever we call the Python function input, but rather there's this feature, command line arguments of programs, that allows you to provide arguments, that is input to the program, just when you're executing it at the command line. So up until now, for instance, recall that we've generally run Python of something.py. For instance, Python of hello.py. And I've never once really executed any words or phrases after the name of the file. But I could. In fact, when you're running programs in a command-line environment like we are, you can provide any number of words or numbers or phrases after the command that you're typing, and all of those will somehow be passed in as inputs to the program itself. You don't have to prompt the user for one thing at a time by manually calling that input function. So what does this mean in real terms? Well, let me go ahead back into VS Code here, and let me propose that we consider how we might leverage a certain module. I'm going to go ahead and create a file called name.py. And I'd like to use a new module this time that's going to give me access to values that have been typed at that command line. But what's this module going to be? Well, this one's going to be called sys. And sys, short for system, contains a whole lot of functionality that's specific to the system itself. Command line. Give me name.py. And I'd like to use a new module this time that's going to give me access access to values that have been typed at that command line. But what's this? Name.py, and I'd like to use it. Propose, what does this mean in real terms? Well, inputs after, like could x.py provide arguments, that is, there's as happens when you comes with other modules in Python, and there's this feature generally known as command line arguments. This is a feature not just of Python, but of languages more generally, that allow you to provide input not when prompted inside of a program, as happens whenever we call the Python function input, but rather there's this feature, command line arguments of programs, that allows you to provide arguments, that is input to the program, just when you're executing it at the command line. So up until now, for instance, recall that we've generally run Python of something.py. For instance, Python of hello.py. And I've never once really executed any words or phrases after the name of the file. But I could. In fact, when you're running programs in a command-line environment like we are, you can provide any number of words or numbers or phrases after the command that you're typing, and all of those will somehow be passed in as inputs to the program itself. You don't have to prompt the user for one thing at a time by manually calling that input function. So what does this mean in real terms? Well, let me go ahead back into VS Code here, and let me propose that we consider how we might leverage a certain module. I'm going to go ahead and create a file called name.py. And I'd like to use a new module this time that's going to give me access to values that have been typed at that command line. But what's this module going to be? Well, this one's going to be called sys. And sys, short for system, contains a whole lot of functionality that's specific to the system itself and the commands that you and I are typing. The documentation for this module is at this URL here, and it lists all of the various functions and variables and the like that come with that module. But we're going to focus on something a little more specific, namely this thing here. It turns out in the sys module in Python, there is a variable that just magically exists for you called argv. It stands for argument vector, which is a fancy way of describing the list of all of the words that the human typed in at their prompt before they hit enter. All of those are seemingly magically provided to you via Python in a variable called sys.argv. This variable is a list, which means that the first element's going to be the first word that you typed, the second element's going to be the second word that you typed, and so forth. And by way of this list, then, can you figure out what words did the human actually type at the prompt and maybe use that to influence the behavior of your own program? So what does this mean now in real terms? Well, in this new tab called name.py, let me go ahead and import sys. Within that sys module is going to give me access to sys.argv, but how might I want to use it? Well, let's do this. Instead of writing a hello world program that all of these times has just looked for the return value of input to figure out what the user wants me to print, let's go ahead and just expect the user to tell us when they run the Python program itself what their name is. And suppose this time I'd like to generate a whole bunch of name tags, initially just one, and in the US here it's very common to wear a sticker on your lapel that says, hello, my name is David, so I want to print out some text that resembles that. The idea being maybe I could enhance this program someday to even send that text straight to the printer and dynamically generate those name tags. Well, let me go ahead now and do this. Let me go ahead and print out, as always, hello, but I'll say a little something more this time to make things more interesting. Hello, my name is, quote unquote. And then after that, I normally have been in the habit of calling input, storing the return value in a variable, and passing in the name of that variable here. But I'm going to instead jump right to this, sys.argv bracket 1. And that's it. I'm going to have a program here that says, hello, my name is, followed by whatever is in sys.argv bracket 1. And notice sys.argv again is a list. And recall from our discussion of loops and intern lists, we use this square bracket notation to get at the various elements inside of a list. All right, let me go down now into my terminal window and run python of name.py. But this time, rather than just hit enter and wait for the program to prompt me for my name, let me proactively just tell this program what my name is at the so-called command line. Here we go, DAVID separated with a space from the name of the file, so that now when I execute python name.py David, I see on the screen, voila, hello, my name is David. So based on this demonstration alone, I think we can infer exactly what's going on in sys.argv, even though it sounds certainly, at first glance, rather complicated here. Here. Let's look up. At sys.argv, I'm going to bracket 1 here. So clearly, sys.argv bracket 1 is storing DAVID, but it's 1. In the past, when we looked at loops, recall that we said that they were 0 indexed. That is, the first element is 0. The next element is 1. This next element is 2, and so forth. And yet here I am treating it as though my name is at the start of the list 1. Well, let me ask this question. What is probably in sys.argv of 0? What is probably in sys.argv of 0? The very first element actually in that list.
Oh, yeah. I think it's like in C, the name of program.
Indeed, it's indeed, like in C and other languages, the name of the program. Well, if we consider what it was I typed, I certainly typed Python, because that's the name of my interpreter, and we don't really need to know that because we're using Python itself. But after that, I did type 2 things. I typed name.py, as I've done so many times, anytime I want Python to interpret a program I've written. And it turns out by convention, what Python does is it stores in sys.argv the name of the file that you're executing or interpreting, followed by any number of other words that you typed. So all this time, we could have been accessing the name of the program, which frankly isn't all that interesting, but we can also now access words that are typed after that prompt as well. But of course, if I don't type anything in, what might happen here? This might be naive of me to assume that there's always going to be something at location 1 in sys.argv. Let me go ahead and try this. Python name.py, and no, I'm not giving you my name because at this point I might not even know that you want my name to be typed, so let me hit enter now, and uh-oh, we see now an error. a so-called exception in Python. This one's a new one. This one's an index error that elaborates list index out of range. And turns out this is actually one of the most common mistakes in programming, whether using a list in Python or arrays or vectors in other languages, is to try to access some element that does not exist. You try to go too far to the left, or you try to go too far to the right in this object that is just a list of some values. So of course, the mistake here is that I'm assuming there's going to be something at location 1 when really it's location 0 that's the only one that has a value. But fixing this is not going to amount to doing bracket 0, because now if I go ahead and rerun this program with no other words after name.py, it says, hello, my name is name.py, which is fine if we're making a name tag for the program, but that's not, of course, what my goal here is instead. So if the fix is not just to change the 1 to a 0, how else might I handle this error? How else might I handle this error? This index error that happens if the user just doesn't remember to or doesn't know to type their actual name at the prompt.
We could always put an exception into the program saying if there's nothing at location 1, we just come out to say, well, okay, we haven't got a parameter or something. But if there is, you continue along with the program.
Perfect. So if I might simplify, we can try to execute this line of code, except if there's an error, we'll deal with it in some other way. Now, ideally, and once I'm a strong enough programmer, I would have anticipated this and written the following code from the get-go. But when you're learning, it's certainly reasonable to see an error. Oh, I didn't realize I should detect that, and then go back and improve your code. But of course, if you read the documentation, you ingrain some of the lessons learned from the past, you'll get into the habit of trying and checking for some of these exceptions yourself. So let me solve this in one possible way, as you proposed here. Let's try to handle this exception as follows. Let me go ahead now, and instead of just blindly calling this print line, let me try to print out, hello, my name is such and such, except if there is an issue, specifically an index error, then what do I want to go ahead and do? I'm going to say something like too few arguments. I could be more explanatory than that, but for now I'm just going to explain to the user that they gave me too few arguments, too few words at the prompt. So now it's still not going to work in quite the way I want. I'm still not going to be able to generate their name tag, but at least they're not going to see some cryptic error message and think that they themselves broke the program. Let me go ahead now and run python of name.py, enter, and too few arguments. OK, let me go ahead now and do python of name.py and type in my name, David, and now we're back in business. And I see that my name is on the screen too. But strictly speaking, I don't have to try to do this. I could actually be a little more defensive in writing this code. And maybe I could check whether or not the user has indeed provided a name or multiple names at the prompt so as to give them more refined error messages as well. So how might I do this? Well, let me go and undo the exception handling I've added. And why don't I instead more modestly try to do this? Let me go ahead and introduce a conditional here. If the length of sys.argv is less than 2, or equivalently equal to just one value, but I'll just stick with less than 2 for now, then go ahead and print out too few arguments. So I want ultimately 2 arguments. I want the name of the program at location 0, and I want the name of the human at location 1. So that's a total of 2 arguments. So if I have fewer than 2 arguments, let's tell the user with this print line, if the length of sys.argv is, say, greater than 2, like they typed in too many words at the prompt, well, let's tell them print, quote unquote, too many arguments, else, if they did get it right and they gave me exactly 2 arguments, else let's go ahead and print what I actually care about. All right, let me go down to my terminal window here and run python of name.py, and voila, a completely different type of error. This one, a syntax error, which we've seen in the past. Now, a syntax error, recall, is mea culpa, like I messed up here and I wrote invalid syntax, and so no amount of conditionals or exception handling is really going to catch this one. I need to go back and just get my program to work because it's not running at all. Well, let me go up here and see. Line 4 is the issue, and indeed, it looks like I have an unterminated string here. I need to go ahead and now add this double quote. So let me go ahead now, and with that red herring gone, let me rerun python of name.py and hit enter, and now we see too few arguments. OK, maybe it wants my full name. Let me go ahead now and run python of name.py, David Malan, typing in both words after the name of the file and hit enter. And now, of course, it's too many arguments. Fine, now I'll oblige and do python of name.py and just David, and there we have it, my name tag printed on the screen. So strictly speaking, we don't have to handle exceptions if we can be a little smarter about it and just check for the things that we're worried about, especially if we want to give the user more refined advice. We don't want to just tell them, no, something went wrong, or we don't want to pass. We want to tell them, no, that's too few. Or no, that's too many. We have conditionals in our vocabulary already via which we can now express that. Well, let me pause here and see if there's any questions now on how we handled the error before with the index error, or how now we're just proactively avoiding all index errors altogether by just checking first, is it too few, is it too many, or is it exactly what we want?
Hiya, thank you. So I was wondering, you touched upon kind of using your full name. Could we then, is there a way going forwards that perhaps we have people that want their full names and want just their first name, that we separate that into like, oh, this person has full name, this person has just the one name?
Absolutely, and allow me to propose we come back to that support for multiple names. But indeed, we could do that. And I should note, too, though, we can support full names right now if I do this. Instead of typing in David space Malan, which is problematic because, again, by definition of how argv works, each word ends up in a specific location in the list. But if I add quotes, single quotes or double quotes at the command line, now Python will view this as 2 total things, the name of the file and this full name. And now when I hit enter, I don't see the quotes. The whole thing is passed in as my full name. And if I want to adapt this further for multiple people, we'll be able to do that as well. Other questions now on this version with if, else, or on except before?
Hi, sir. I want to ask you, can we use multiple else statement?
Can you use multiple else's statements? No. Else is the last catch-all statement that you can have. You can have multiple if statements in the middle, but not multiple else's.
Okay.
All right. All right, well, let's turn our attention back now to this code and see if we